But you didn't come to hear me. You came here to hear Dr. Lyle Dorsett, who has had his hand in a number of scholarly areas and areas of ministry, had a very fruitful career as a historian. He's really a master biographer. He's written several biographies of very important religious figures, including C.S. Lewis. I think many of you know that writer. And C.S. Lewis's wife, Joy. You may have heard about his autobiography called Surprised by Joy. It's the joy of Christ and salvation and the truth, and also the joy, this lady who came into his life. Dr. Dorsett is an expert on C.S. Lewis and the circle of writers around Lewis, and really a master historian and biographer. He's also an ordained Anglican priest and has a long experience in ministry across the country and really around the world, because he and his wife are involved in international missionary and relief work. But he's also got a real heart for the men and women in the military, and especially chaplains. And I learned today that in his home in Birmingham, he has basically a one-man museum of World War II artifacts. So he's a curator of his own private museum, and people around the world have given him just these wonderful artifacts, memories of their own experience, and a real tribute to especially chaplains, but all servicemen and women involved in World War II. Well, the book that caught our attention is the one that we actually have for sale. If you want to leave with a copy of it tonight, have a few more left. 2 left? Okay, so 2 lucky people can grab a copy of that. Serving God and Country, U.S. Military Chaplains in World War II. And so we thought, why not just assemble a few folks in the military or who support and love the military and have Dr. Dorsett speak. I forgot to thank Chaplain Johnson for helping us organize this. Where's Mr. Bakke? Right here, yes. And thank you for helping us arrange this, as well as Monsignor. Who is either in service right now in the military or has ever served, worn the uniform in your life? Just raise your hand. Why don't we have a round of applause for those folks? So we appreciate what you have done and what you continue to do, and we're all in your debt. We really owe you a great deal. And I know Dr. Dorsett shares this sentiment. So Lyle, come and share a little bit about your research and your love for these folks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a great privilege to be here since Wednesday night. I've been welcomed by so many people. I've been fed well. I've been encouraged. It's always I love being around students. It was great to be around so many students today. Students keep my wife and me supple. You people knock the barnacles off the hull of our souls, so that's good. We like to stay around you. But no, it's been a great time, and several years ago, I decided to write a book which I've titled Serving God and Country, U.S. Military Chaplains in World War II. And by the way, they say how many books do you have left? Well, if you run out, I'll give this one to somebody, but I maybe I'll throw it out on the floor and see who can get it fast. But it'll be the free one, you know. Well, anyway, I do have a World War II museum, and many years ago now I was in a Marine Reserve unit, and there were a number of old salts, as we called them, who had been in World War II and the Korean War. And these guys were heroes to me, and I learned a lot from them. And every now and then I'd get a glimpse of what a chaplain had done to encourage them and keep their morale going and going forward. And so I've never really gotten over that, but I'm a midlife convert, and I'm an historian. I was an historian before I became a follower of Jesus Christ, but I've loved history and written history and studied history, and so doing this book was a way to bring together a couple of things I really love. And I do have a World War II museum. If you come to Birmingham, call me, Lyle Dorsett. I can't offer you room, bed and breakfast, but it's a 722 square foot museum. It has its own temperature and humidity control. It has museum lights. I've been accused of having a Marine Corps shrine because there's a huge Marine Corps section. That isn't quite true. But anyway, it's a museum that I would say 80% of the things in there, I know something about who had these things, who they were. I have a grouping from a man from Texas who had 4 combat jumps with the 82nd Airborne in World War II. I have one of his jumpsuits with a hole in the side of it and blood stains all over it. When you have things like this, these are national treasures. And the museum is dedicated to the glory of God and to the memories of the men and women, the 12.5 million men and women who put on the uniform in World War II so we could be free. Today, if we choose to speak German, that's nice. If we want to learn Japanese, we can. If we had lost the war, it would be a different thing. And people gave much. I have people come to the museum and say, would you just sell me this one item? I say, these things aren't for sale, they're national treasures. Well, what would you have to have? I said, you can't buy it. It doesn't have a price on it. So, and I have a World War II Jeep. I have a 1944 Willis Jeep. Even has the original seats on it, and the original canvas. It's a church that I pastored up in the Chicago area. I didn't take a salary from the church because I was teaching full time, and 3 or 4 years into it, they bought me that Jeep for a birthday present, and well, what a great thing. And anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about the Chaplain Corps in World War II. I know things have changed somewhat, but especially you chaplains, I just want to say this. You guys make an enormous difference in people's lives. And in World War II, it was no different than it is today, except for one very important difference. And I think I could describe it best by saying, I have in my museum a print, and it very commonly hung in American homes during World War II era. And it's a picture of, it's a young soldier with his 4-pocket tunic on. He's just out of basic training. He doesn't have a stripe. He doesn't have a medal. He's got no ribbons. He's standing there, and Monsignor, would you help me here? You can play like you're the soldier right now, and I'll pray like I'm Mom.
But I don't have any stripes or ribbons.
No, that's why I picked him. Yeah. But Mom is like this, and in front of her son and her is a pulpit with an open Bible and a purple stole. Back behind them is a stained glass window, the famous one of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Next to the podium or the pulpit is an American flag. Now thank you very much. That's nervy of some Anglican priest to ask the Monsignor to come up. Forgive me. Anyway, what's going on here is that there are really 3 great pillars that held this country up at that time. Mother, God, and country. And Mom is there with her son, and they're patriots. There's the flag. Mom is there. Jesus is in the background. It's marvelous. And I had purchased one of these and had it in my museum. And when I was teaching at the University of Denver, there was we had a military history program. We did a master's in military history and a PhD because there were so many career military in the area. There was Lowry Air Force Base, there was Fort Carson, the Air Force Academy was just down the road, and so we had a lot of students. And one night we had a graduate seminar for PhD candidates. We had a gathering of them. They were taking a seminar on prisoners of war in World War II. So we had a couple of guys that had been Marines who were captured, and a sailor. We had the first American officer who was captured by the Germans. He was flying escort with the British, was shot down in early '42 and cooled his heels in a prison camp. So he, at this time, his last name was Clark, General Clark. He was Commandant of the Air Force Academy. And he came to speak with these enlisted men that were there. And at dinner, I asked the general this. We had just about a year before had all of our prisoners come home from the Hanoi Hilton, Vietnam War. And as you might remember, if you're old enough to remember that at all, a lot of these guys were at loggerheads with one another. Guys were saying, I'm going to get that creep. He sold us out. And I said, General, you know about World War II, I don't. But I don't hear anywhere that our prisoners were fighting like that amongst one another. He said, oh, we weren't. I said, what's the difference? Were the Vietnamese torturing people? He said, oh, no, it's not torture. He said, nobody could improve on the Japanese for torture. He said, it wasn't that at all. He said, what it was, and he said, I want you professors to hear me, and I don't know a single one of you, so I don't know who you are and what you teach. But I want to tell you the difference. He said, in World War II, almost every man who went into combat had three things more important than himself to live and fight and die for. His country, he was a patriot. He loved his family, especially his mother, and he probably loved God.
I'm okay.
You okay? Am I not hearable?
I'm deaf.
Okay, I'm sorry. And he said, in the universities now, he said, I don't know about you professors, but people are trying to tear all of this out of every young person that comes into the university. You make fun of anybody that believes in God. You hate institutions. You burn flags. And you make fun of traditional families. And he said, what you're doing is you set up the young men that went into combat in Vietnam, you set them up to go in with nothing greater than themselves to serve and live and die for. And he said, people begin to unravel when that happens. And he said, I don't know where you men are. It happened to be all men on the faculty that were there that night. He said, but if you're part of this, you need to think about it. Well, that got me to thinking at that time, and as I look back, as I did research for this book on military chaplains in World War II, the suicide rate was so low among the American military that they didn't keep a separate category for it. Today, the suicide rate is enormous in the United States, and it's higher in the military per capita. You guys know you're wrestling with these issues. And we say, what's going on? It doesn't occur to most people that part of what's going on is that we've laundered the Judeo-Christian worldview out of our culture. We got young men and women going in with not anything they've been taught. It's all about me. Get another selfie, self. Even have a magazine by that title. So this is the advantage people had in World War II is that most of them believed something. Most of them thought the Ten Commandments was a pretty good idea. They probably didn't obey most of them, but they still thought it's pretty important glue to hold the nation together. They loved their families, had a high view of family, and they certainly were patriotic for the most part. You can find people that they didn't fit that, but the typical person did. And one of the things that I think was going on as I look back over these things, and I interviewed many soldiers, sailors, and Marines who'd served in World War II. I had interviewed a few chaplains, but most of the chaplains had already passed away when I was doing the research because they were a lot older than the typical a combat veteran. But the thing that I began to find is that the people would go in, and that when the war began, there was a pretty serious problem, and this is where the chaplains came into the situation. After World War I and the fiasco of saving the world for democracy, you had the seminaries were, whatever denomination or tradition, the seminaries were very anti-war. We're training people, that we're not going to be in another war. And there's this anti-war sentiment. We're not prepared for World War II. When we get in it, you got a bunch of troops that are going in who've been taught, this is evil to kill. We can't do this. Look what happened in World War I. And there's all this confusion. And the career officers, especially Army and Marine Corps, would talk about it a lot. I found a lot of evidence. How are we going to toughen these guys up and teach them to kill people when they believe it's so sinful to kill people? How do we teach drafted men about just war? We got to win that battle while we're trying to get them in shape. And then we got another problem. We got to tell their mothers back at home and tell their families, their wives, that when they go off to camp and when they go into combat, they're still going to have their spiritual values encouraged. They'll still have somebody to care for their souls. They'll have a safe place to go for confession. They'll have a place to receive Holy Communion, or the various things that they need. So you're trying to take care of the home front, to let them know we're doing a good thing. And on the other side, you're trying to help these guys overcome some of these things that they wrestle with in their minds. A crucial role. But I want to read to you something. When the war ended, General Vandegrift, who by the time of the end of the war was Commandant of the Marine Corps, he was the Marine general officer who led the Marines over Guadalcanal, a horrid battle, and it was he distinguished himself there and then did throughout the war. But he spoke to a conference of military chaplains in Washington, D.C. in January 1946. I want you to hear something of what he said to these chaplains from his angle of vision as a Marine, and then I want you to know that this does not just apply to the Marine Corps that he experienced, but this is across the board for the military. Listen to this. The ministrations you have carried to our fighting men. He's speaking to a group of military chaplains who had served in the war. And by the way, it was October 45, not January 46. The ministrations you have carried to our fighting men have been an epic of spiritual heroism. Never at any time, to my knowledge, have our men lacked for religious care and guidance. You chaplains have gone wherever they have gone. To millions of American boys, you have been a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. In this war, they turn to you constantly. You were more than conductors of devotional services. You were helpers, advisors, listeners, and comforters. You prayed with them, toiled with them, laughed with them. I recall a sign on one chaplain's tent which made it easier for a man to talk to him. It simply read, "See me at your earliest inconvenience." Like the teachers of old, you did not wait for men to come to you. You went out to the men. You made any sacrifice to carry on the task of bringing God to men and men to God. Your life in the field was rigorous and perilous. Once when a chaplain came in weary and dirty from a day in the lines, I remember hearing a young Marine say with awe in his voice, "That man sure is doing God a lot of good out there." Isn't that beautiful? Samuel Johnson once wrote, "Religion, which is animated only by faith and hope, will glide by degrees out of the mind. unless it be invigorated and re-impressed by external ordinances, by stated calls to worship, and the salutary influence of example. America's young men traveled far from home, but they did not go one step away from their churches. Their faith could not and did not fade. Stated calls to worship and the salutary influence of example went with them even into the thick of battle. Men from your ranks marched at the side into the valley of the shadow of death. I frequently noted in the field how chaplains to a man sought out frontline action. I assumed that was because, as one put it to me at the time, this is where the fighting man needs God most. And that's where some of them know him for the first time. That's what chaplains can take. They have and they do. I interviewed a number of soldiers and sailors and Marines to get their memories of chaplains. Seldom did they remember a name. I have a feeling the chaplains would have liked that. But they remembered the chappie there with them, the sky pilot on their side. I met a man, he just recently passed away, who lived in Birmingham, a retired career Army officer, and he was a young lieutenant in an infantry unit in World War II. And he told me this story. I said, do you have any memories of chaplains? He said, oh, I have a few, yes. He said, but one stands out. I want to tell you about him. And he said, I was an Episcopalian. He was at the time. He said, I'm an Episcopalian, and I want the Blessed Sacrament. And he said, a lot of the Protestants just didn't offer communion very much. He said, but this Catholic chaplain knew who I was and what I wanted, and he'd wink at me, and he said, they never carded you before you went into combat. They'd go ahead and give you communion. And he said, I received communion. About 2 hours later, I took my platoon up on the front line in the Battle of the Bulge. And he said, all hell was breaking loose. The Germans were pouring 88s on us. The trees are splintering and flying apart. And he said, I got a big flesh wound in my thigh. And he said, I came off the line to go back and get patched up so I could get back up with my men. And he said, I'm coming off the line. And he said, at a crouch, here comes this chaplain, this Catholic priest who had given me communion 2 or 3 hours earlier. And he said, he's got stuff in each hand. I don't know what he had. And he said, he's at a crouch and he's running forward. And he said, I stopped him and said, Chappie, where in the H do you think you're going? He said, I'm going to the front. He said, you can't go up there. They're dying like flies up there. And he said, he raised up a bit. He said, then that's precisely where I need to be. Off he went. Isn't that beautiful? That's what it's about. That, he said to me, I felt a comfort in the wake of that, unlike I had at any other time. There was a marvelous story of a Jewish chaplain. We got a bug flying around here. We'll shoot him down with some 105 howitzers in a minute. But anyway, this one Marine told me, he said, they'd hit Tarawa, and they're hunkered down behind some logs, and he said, the Japanese are just blasting us to no end. And he said, our platoon leader's about ready to say, let's move, got to go forward. And he said, there were about a dozen men down here, and he said, there was a Jewish chaplain. He said, not a Jewish guy in the group except the chaplain. And he said, somebody yelled, Chappie, we need a prayer. And he said that Jewish chaplain started the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. And he said a dozen Protestants and Catholics joined in. And he said it gave us courage. And when the word came, we got up and went forward. I met a man, he's still a friend of mine. His name is Bob Slaughter. He's in his 90s. And he was in the first wave of the Normandy invasion. And he was in an infantry unit that had over 400% turnover the first 40 days. He had somehow survived the invasion, and he was outside of St. Lo, and the Germans were up there with heavy artillery, and they had him packed down. And he told me this story. He said, my buddy and I, he said, we knew we had to get under cover, and he said, we got a shovel out, and we hastily dug a little foxhole to jump in until our artillery or airplanes could knock out some of these big German guns. He said, as soon as the foxhole was done, we jumped in. He said, then a third uninvited guy jumps in on top of us. He said, I look up, and here's a guy with a helmet on with a cross on the front of it. And he says to me, he says, Dorsett, you tell me what are the law of averages of this happening. He says, I look up, and he says, I know this sounds rather random, but does anybody, I know in this unit somewhere, there's a Sergeant Bob Slaughter, if he's still alive. Does anybody know where he is? And he says, I'm Slaughter, Chaplain. He said, well, he said, I'm not pleased to meet you under these circumstances, but I've been trying to reach you since just before we shipped out for the invasion. He said, your father passed away at home in Richmond, Virginia. Your mother went to they belonged to a Presbyterian church, went to the Presbyterian pastor and said, could you get the word to my son? I want him to get leave to come home and help me for a while. And he said, by the time the word filtered down, you were ready for the invasion. I couldn't even find you. And he said, as you can tell, we're a little too busy for me to send you home right now. But he said, I did want to find you for this reason. To tell you that your mother's fine. She'd hoped she could get a hold of you. And I want you to know that God cares for you. This man said, I'll never forget that. I said, what was that chaplain's name? He said, I have no idea. I said, did you ever see him again? No. I said, do you think he survived the war? He said, I have no idea. He said, but I can tell you, he brought God to me. In hearing about my dad's death, but then the comfort to know that God cared enough to get this guy to come and say to me, gave me real hope. I want to say something else about the chaplains. During World War II, there were, next to the Army Air Corps, and the Army Air Corps was the most highly decorated per capita of any group of military in World War II. They had enormous casualties for the Army Air Corps. But number 2 in per capita KIA, WIA was the Chaplains Corps. Now that tells you something about where they were often in harm's way, generally in harm's way. No chaplain was required to go into combat up to the front line, but few of them who didn't insist on being with their men. I've got stories that are legion about Navy chaplains who were on ships, and as the Marines got ready to invade Saipan or Tinian, somebody'd say, Chappie, you don't want to go in there? And they'd say, I'm going with my guys. And they'd go and be with them. And I heard most of these stories from people who weren't the chaplains. So it's not that they were tooting their own horn. There were about 9,000 U.S. Army chaplains in World War II, and just over 2,800 Navy chaplains who served, of course, the Marine Corps and the Navy, and they usually rotated. Every denomination had quotas, but few met their quotas. I think that one of the things that stood out to me as I studied this was how many Catholic priests who were chaplains were up in the front and often died. I talked to some Catholic friends, maybe some of you priests and parishioners can help me understand it, but I think part of it is this. I think there's something about not having a wife and children at home that maybe makes you say, hey, I'm not going to leave my wife a widow. But I think there's probably something much more important. You men want to give last rites to dying men. And you're going to get up there because you're driven by that commitment, that vow, in a way that maybe others aren't. I don't know, I'm not making them, but there's something there. And it just a per capita KIA rate and where they were just tells me something. I don't know what you do with that. You can sort it out and figure it out. One other hidden thread of history that I want to tell you about is that, now think on this. In World War II, over 50%, about 55% of every Jewish rabbi joined the military. The Methodists couldn't meet the quotas. Presbyterians couldn't meet the quotas. I'm sorry, the Lutherans, probably Missouri Synod, but they didn't meet all their quotas. The Baptists didn't meet, the Catholics didn't meet their quotas. Nobody did except the Jews. And I read a marvelous autobiography of a Jewish chaplain who said, you know something? Somebody asked us, why over 50% of the rabbi corps in this nation has put on the uniform and gone? He said, we got two reasons for being in this thing. We love this country and don't want to see it go down any more than the rest of you. But if we don't win this war in Europe, our people are all gone. So we're going to go to build up morale. It's interesting, all the layers of things that drove people and got them to do things. I will, Pastor Johnson, tell you, Chaplain Johnson, about one Lutheran. I forgot which synod he was in, doesn't make any difference. Highly decorated, couple of silver stars, and his regimental write-ups every month. And he would get, these guys had to turn out a monthly report, you know, how many this, how many that, what are you doing? And I found 2 or 3 of his where he just, we're so damn busy fighting, I don't have time to fill this out. And then he just sent it in. And I liked that. And on the reports, his commanders would say, this guy is a man's man. The men love him. And his driver, his chaplain's assistant, who drove the Jeep, they were going down through some hedgerow areas, and the Jeep driver said this, he walked in front of the Jeep. He didn't want me shot first. He's walking in front of the Jeep, and I'm back here driving his Jeep. Phenomenal stuff. Researching this book has made me proud to be an American. It's made me proud to be a clergyman. And I just wish I had another life to live when I was young enough where I could go in as a chaplain. So for those of you that are chaplains, may God bless you. May He multiply your kind. And I know that in this war that we're in now, even though it's not declared, we are certainly in a war, you're going to be greatly needed. I have several students from Beeson Divinity School. 2 of them, one of them's with the Marine Corps right now, another's with Special Ops, another one is with the 101st Airborne. And to the chaplain, they tell me this. Increasingly, the young men and women in uniform that we meet know nothing about the Christian faith. They don't even know who Jesus is. It's not that they come in as backsliders or indifferent believers. They come in with nothing but themselves. Maybe some vague spirituality. You people know this better than I do because you hang out with them. But there is a war for souls. Though that tripartite set of pillars we had in World War II is gone today. We've got to rebuild it. There's a war for these souls, and there's no place probably where men and women feel more vulnerable than in the military. So may your tribe multiply, and all of you others who serve in the National Guard here and serve in the military, thank you for serving, and may God bless you.